I want to be more intimate with you, Lord.
I actually didn't abstain when I was a young girl. As a matter of fact, I became sexually active at 13 years of age. In a matter of months, went from feeling nervous to hold a boy's hand to actually having unprotected sex. The marriage was not healthy. He ended up leaving. And so at 22 years of age, I was a single mom with a 2-year-old daughter. We cannot instill purity in our kids without planting a bigger foundation of spiritual discipleship. In other words, it always goes back ultimately to their heart for God.
Welcome to Pure Passion. I'm David.
And I'm Amy.
And we're your hosts for today's program. Laura Gallier is a young lady who began having sex at the age of 13. But before long, she was a mom with a daughter and no husband.
Today, Laura is the director of Inspiring Abstinence, a ministry designed to show teens why to say no to premarital sex and parents how to do the same for their own children.
One of the reasons that kids engage in sex, in spite of messages from parents not to, is because the parents often fail to lay the foundation of why it is important to abstain until marriage.
Laura will be covering the why behind the commandment of God and give us tools for showing our kids the incredible beauty and benefit that lies beneath the prohibition against extramarital sex.
It's not enough to be told the consequences of disobedience. Kids must also see the wisdom and the love of God behind the commandment.
So let's listen to Laura and find out why.
Some people find it hard to believe that I go around and speak about abstinence, and I actually didn't abstain when I was a young girl. As a matter of fact, I became sexually active at 13 years of age. And I was raised by a single mother. I knew better. She had instructed me and conveyed to me that she did not approve of me having sex before I was married, but that was all she said. And we communicated very little about that. So I found myself as a young girl looking for love in all the wrong places, as we commonly do. And my friends were doing it, quite honestly, and with scarcely any thought, in a matter of months, went from feeling nervous to hold a boy's hand to actually having unprotected sex. And I remained sexually active throughout my teen years. At 20 years of age, I was off at college and a member of a very prestigious dance team, and I had a boyfriend, and as was my custom, I ended up having sex with him, and I got pregnant. And so at 20 years of age, I dropped out of school. I came home. I got married to try to salvage the situation, but the marriage was not healthy. He ended up leaving. And so at 22 years of age, I was a single mom with a 2-year-old daughter, and ironically found myself in the very predicament I grew up in, which was a single mom, the very thing that I didn't want. And it was at that moment that I realized that God's commands and his biblical standards are not to keep me from having fun, or not to restrict my freedom. On the contrary, they're to protect me and create a blessed life. And so at 22 years of age, I drew a proverbial line in the sand, and I determined not only to obey God in that area, but as a whole, that I think a lot of times we are quick to call Jesus our Savior, but we leave that Lord part off, and that obedience that he calls us to. And so by his grace, certainly not my own willpower strength, but by his grace, I began living for him and serving him with my whole heart. And shortly after that, I met a man named Patrick, and he's a God-fearing man. And very soon in our courtship, we committed to wait until we were married to be intimate, and we did wait, and we've been married, we're coming up on 10 years, and till this day, it is something that I treasure. It still means the world to me because it laid such a foundation of respect. We know we can be trusted. We know that we put Christ first because we did that before we're married, and so now we do that after we're married. And so I have a unique perspective because I know what it's like to disobey God's biblical standards and live a promiscuous life, and I also know what it's like to get forgiveness from that and to walk in obedience. And I can honestly say I have zero regrets for following God's plan, and like I said, I'm still reaping the benefits today in my marriage. I did know the Lord, but I was not discipled and my mind was not renewed, so therefore my lifestyle looked just like I didn't know God in a lot of ways. And I don't know that I justified it as much as I just hid from God. I did what comes natural. I would go into guilt, fear, and hiding. Then I would repent and promise not to do that again. But then because, again, I had not renewed my mind, I would enter into those relationships again. And actually, that's something I'm really passionate about, is the fact that parents, a lot of times, we have good intentions. We talk to our kids, we tell them that we don't want them having sex, but we never lay a foundation for why. And what happened to me as a young woman is I would read in the Bible, right there, you know, in Hebrews 13:4, that fornicators will be judged. I knew God didn't approve of it. But then everything in society was telling me, you know, you don't need a wedding ring. That doesn't change anything. As long as you love each other, it's okay. So it was definitely a battle in my mind. And I would go back and forth about, you know, is the Bible right? Is that scripture old-fashioned? And then because I didn't have mentorship or discipleship, and like I said, I didn't have a concept of lordship in my life, that no, Christ has not only has he saved me, but he's called me to live for him. I didn't understand that. So you could say that I was destroyed for lack of knowledge in that sense. I didn't get away with anything. And that's what I tell young people. Certainly worse things could have happened. You know, there are 1 out of every 4 sexually active teens can expect to get an STD in the first year of being sexually active. You know, there are a myriad of consequences that I didn't get or experience, but I did get pregnant. I did live with the guilt and shame. As a married woman, years later, through social media, you have past lovers, for lack of a better word, that are contacting you. You know, there are a myriad of consequences that you don't get away from. We're welcome into God's presence, but when we're in guilt, fear, and hiding, and we're knowingly doing things we shouldn't, then it compromises our confidence to come boldly before the throne room of grace. And what I find, to expound on that, what I find when I talk to young people about sex is you would think that they would have a lot of objections and perhaps sit with their arms crossed and be skeptical, but I find the opposite. I find that they're looking for standards. They're looking for a reason to think of sex in a more sacred way. I think young people are actually discouraged, honestly, by the way society has made it such a casual, careless thing. So what I find when I talk to young people about my experiences is that they're encouraged by what I have to say. A lot of times as parents, you know, we're all tempted to do this. We'll tell our kids something and they'll say why, and we'll say because I said so. You know, and what really we're indicating in that moment is that I have a strong conviction about this, you don't, but do it anyway. And we're really setting ourselves up for failure when we do that. Over 80% of parents admit that when it comes to sex, they don't know what to say, when to say it, or how to talk to their kids about sex. They mean well. They don't like the idea of their son having sex or their daughters having sex, but they don't know how to present a convincing case, and that has been my passion. After I repented and changed my lifestyle, the Lord started showing me more and more biblical reasons that truly God's plan is so much more wise and profound than worldly trends. And so my goal is to equip parents so that they don't just say, you're going to stay a virgin, so help me, because it doesn't work, but that they can actually sit down with their sons and daughters and present not only the biblical truths, but the common sense, logical arguments so that young people have that aha moment where that light goes off and they say, okay, for the first time, I understand why.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone. Pure passion.
Sex is a covenant enacting ritual. And when a man and a woman get married, that's a covenant relationship, and sex was to be the sealing covenant act or ceremony, if you will. And it was to bind a husband and wife together for life. And it was a beautiful thing, and it was meant to feel good, and it was meant to be exciting. It was meant to be all of those things. But I like to use the analogy of a flowing river. If you have a river flowing beautifully, it's great for recreation. You can enjoy a day by the banks. But whenever there's a flood and it goes beyond those banks, it becomes destructive and deadly. And I said that to say that God's plan for sex within the confines of marriage has such blessing and protection. If you become pregnant, even if you weren't planning on it, if you're married, it's okay. It's going to be okay, and that child's going to be okay. As a matter of fact, when it comes to STDs, if this generation, if every young person decided in this generation that they were going to wait to have sex until they were married, we would eradicate STDs in a single generation. So God's plan, it's a plan of protection, it's a plan of blessing, and what happens, my husband and I like to use the illustration of a sticky note, and how if you take a sticky note and you stick it and you pull it off and you stick it and you pull it off, it starts to lose its ability to be adhesive, and that's what happens with sex. The more as young people we go out there and have intimacy with one person after the next, sex loses its binding power and starts to become commonplace. 8,000 teenagers a day, it's estimated, contract an STD. 1 in 4 25-year-olds who are promiscuous will have an STD. Pregnancy, 1/3 of every young lady will get pregnant before she's 20. 40% of those pregnancies will end in abortion. And while those statistics are horrifying, there's really no way to measure the emotional ramifications. I'm meeting with young people more and more. This happened just this last week with a young lady who's married, and yet that young man she slept with in high school is coming around again, and she is having a hard time resisting him because these are some boundaries that she's crossed. Obviously, we're seeing young people bring babies into the world that they're not prepared to take care of, not only financially, but emotionally. And so I think the consequences are widespread, and it's ultimately undermining family. And we know that family is the strength of a nation. As promiscuity becomes more and more socially acceptable, we're seeing more and more people cohabitate and bring their kids into that. And we're seeing molestation go up as a result. I mean, you could talk for hours, truly, about the consequences of going outside God's plan. We know that approximately 50% of marriages now end in divorce, and approximately 50% of high school students are sexually active. And so we are definitely seeing, there's no question, that as sex is taken lightly, commitment is taken lightly, and therefore divorce starts to become more prevalent. Again, God created sex to produce a unique bond between a man and a woman because they are to be lifelong helpmates together. But what happens is when we do this outside of marriage, even physically speaking, research indicates that you release certain hormones in sexual activity that causes an imprinting of sorts, where the mental images and emotions associated with that experience are stored in your mind with heightened permanence. Certainly the one flesh union through sex is spiritual in nature, but it has very practical physical manifestations. I mean, the first, most obvious one is we can produce a child together and literally create one flesh. In addition to that, though, research proves that during sex, the body releases certain hormones that create what they call an imprinting, meaning that the emotions, the memories, the mental images of that experience tend to stay in the mind with more permanence. And so what you have is perhaps you have some high school students, and they enter into a casual sexual relationship with a girlfriend, boyfriend, and then they break it off. They intend to move on, and then they're shocked when months, even years later, very vivid images and memories and emotions surface, and it's just not as easy to move on as people make it. 10% of children, they're not even young people, they're children, have had sex before they turn 14. Because our culture and the media is so sex saturated, we can't afford to wait until our kids are 15 or 16. And in my book, I explain that even when our children are young, toddlers, we can start planting seeds for monogamy and abstinence by explaining that God has a mate for you, one person. And we can pray with our children and start to reinforce the notion that there's one person out there, not just one person for one season at a time, but one person for life, and that we're waiting for that person. And then when they're old enough, we can start to introduce the practicality of that wait, meaning sexually. And so I don't ever provide a blanket age, because obviously it differs depending on the child, but if we're waiting until our kids are 14, 15 years old, we're waiting too long, because there's just so much that they see and hear at school and from their peers. I encourage parents that if we don't step up to the plate and talk about it and use those words that make us uncomfortable, that our children will hear those words from the wrong source and be given the wrong message. Just this week, my daughter and I were talking, and the subject of masturbation came up, and I was explaining that to her and talking to her about that, and she had not heard the term masturbation, but she had heard the derogatory term for that and knew what it was, but just hadn't heard it from me. So even in my own home, she's 12 years old, I'm realizing the need to go ahead and say those words that make us blush, and certainly it makes me blush at times, but our children's purity is on the line. And again, because we have such a blatant theme in our media of sexuality, and certainly among their peers, we have to go to bat and go there and talk about those things. And I think it makes it easier when you have an explanation and you know what you want to say, which is what I've attempted to provide parents with.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone. Pure passion.
Sexuality is an appetite, and I don't ever want my children or a young person to feel ashamed for having desires and feelings. We know God put those there ultimately to attract us to our spouse. But having said that, once we go down the line of masturbating and stimulating ourselves, not only are we focusing on erotic images and mental fantasies, but now we're going to create a pattern where we get momentary pleasure followed by an extreme emptiness and loneliness, because we've taken something, sexual feelings, that was intended to be a give and take, an intimate bonding experience, and we've experienced it all by ourselves. And so talk about the fact that even though masturbation promises to please, it ultimately enslaves and can become an addiction and actually equate to sexual dysfunctions in marriage, in men, and a variety of consequences from something seemingly innocent. The best thing we can do is guard our eyes and guard our ears from sexual stimulants, and do our best by God's grace to let that appetite sleep, like it says in Song of Solomon, not to arouse love, meaning sexual love and sexual feelings, until it's time, which would be marriage. I think that's so funny. Oral sex is not sex. I mean, it's called oral sex. And anytime we're experiencing a climatic feeling with someone, we are bonding. We are taking something that was meant to be precious and intimate between a husband and wife. And I always ask young people this. I say, imagine your future spouse is out there somewhere, and they close their eyes and they imagine that right now he or she is involved in oral sex. How do you feel about that? And they whine and shout, and no, I don't want that. Of course you don't. Of course we don't. We don't want our future spouse doing that. So certainly that's just far too intimate. We know that our body's nakedness was not intended to be exposed to multiple partners, but again, to that one special person who's committed to love us for life. It's unrealistic not to wait. And what I mean by that is, let's say a 16-year-old decides to become sexually active with his girlfriend, and every few days he's having sex, and then there comes the inevitable breakup. And now his body, psychologically, emotionally, he's become used to this sort of physical gratification. Now what's he going to do? Is he just going to find someone to satisfy him? Within marriage, that's the only time that we can be assured that we have a partner to have sex with. You know, basically, we're left with feast or famine whenever we're single and we open that door. And as far as it being realistic, there are plenty of young people who are waiting. I know young people who have made that decision and on into their late 20s gotten married and remained a virgin, and it becomes a matter of setting good boundaries. You know, they're not going to their girlfriend's house late at night when mom and dad are out of town and watching movies in the dark on the couch. They're setting boundaries to protect their sexual appetite because they want to honor God in that way, and they recognize that it is worth it to wait. And the problem with pornography is you've got paid individuals under the direction of a producer or director doing certain sexual things to make money, and they're not realistic. It's not the way women want to be treated. And what happens is when young men especially look at pornography and they get into pornography, then when they get older and they get married, suddenly they find that their precious wife is not as arousing as those extreme perverted things they've looked at. So once again, that thing that promised to please ends up becoming enslaving. It's one thing to sit a young person down, throw some statistics at them, talk about the consequences 10, 15 years down the line. It's another thing to make a decision that in my home, as a parent, we're going to have a standard of purity. It's going to affect what we log on to. It's going to affect what we watch on TV. And I'm going to disciple my kids, because this needs to be clarified. We cannot instill purity in our kids without planting a bigger foundation of spiritual discipleship. In other words, it always goes back ultimately to their heart for God. It does. At the end of the day, if our kids do not love and fear and respect a holy, forgiving God, then we're not going to get very far with our efforts to get them to stay away from illicit things. Because let's face it, we can't monitor them 24 hours a day. And so I would just say to that certainly there are very practical things we could talk about the negative consequences, but at the end of the day, it has to be the bigger picture of serving God and knowing who He is and truly believing as a young person that God has my best interests at heart. If God says that I'm to stay away from this, there's a reason for that. And it takes time to build that foundation. That is not something where we schedule a 2-hour talk and then, get to say, hey, I had the talk and I'm done. It takes a commitment. And I say this a lot, it is easy to drop our kids off at youth group and pick them up an hour and a half later. It is a much bigger thing and takes a lot more sacrifice to actually disciple my kids in the Lord and make sure that they know Him, and that I'm not just conveying a bunch of rules and standards and shoulds and should nots, but that everything I'm teaching them about their purity is tied back to a holy, loving, present, active, exciting, wonderful God. I do parent workshops, and that is the thing I am most passionate about, is going in and speaking to parents and helping, first of all, reassure them that this is something they can do. They can effectively talk to their kids about sex. I also like to take time to explain the bigger picture and how we can create a culture of purity in our home. So I do parent workshops, and I also do teen and young adult presentations and get the young people excited and motivated to do the study with their parents, which is the ultimate goal. And for those young people that they do not have that home situation where their parents will do the study with them, I have resources and material for them, and I work with churches to help them get small groups going within the youth ministry so that every young person gets the benefit of the study.
Laura told us that ultimately, victory in this battle against lust and temptation goes back to our heart for God. If we spend the time to cultivate a deep love for Him, we will receive into ourselves the wherewithal to resist lesser things.
Guarding our heart and mind against those things that are known to stimulate lust is also another vital component in this war against sexual sin.
Also, learning the incredible design and purpose that lies beneath the creation of human sexuality is of great importance. Because if we know and understand that human sexuality and the expression is a sign and symbol of the love between Christ and the church, then we will be much more inclined to keep it holy.
If you are not yet married and have kept yourself from sexual morality, I want to encourage you that you are doing the right thing, and there will be great benefit to you both in this life and the life to come.
For those of you who have listened to the wrong voice on this subject, there is grace if you will turn from your sin and give yourself in love to the obedience of Jesus Christ. Although you may still suffer some of the earthly consequences that sexual immorality brings, God is willing to remove the eternal consequences of your behavior.
No matter where you are on that continuum, Jesus Christ is always the right answer. Live for that ultimate marriage between God and man, which, coincidentally, will bring immeasurable blessing to your sex life in marriage here on earth.
And let's all commit to teaching the next generation the true meaning of sexuality and the blessing of doing it God's way.
Taking